being an outsider is a function primarily of having a different experience. It's not really an outsider, it's a divergent experience. And it's something that has been a theme throughout my life. So being relatively ostracized from the culture and sent to a Waldorf school by hippie parents would be, one of the first distinct events. Being kept away from media until the age of 11. I think maybe at age 9, my parents allowed a radio into the house, but other than that, no TV, no media. Having trauma at an early age with symptoms of nightmares and learning disabilities. I would reclassify those as teaching disabilities, meaning that when you lack a body of teachers, or when the body of teachers lacks trauma literacy, you can't teach a child with complex PTSD in the same way or until you deal with the underlying trauma. And so when that's not done, it's not usually diagnosed as a teaching disability and a parenting disability. It's diagnosed as a learning disability because teachers do whatever they're doing, and the problem comes up when the demographic of children with PTSD emerge. Being in the demographic of the 10 to 20% of neurologically more sensitive individuals, which runs through many mammalian groups, referencing Dr. Elaine Aron's work, again puts me in another 10 to 20% minority. The traumatic symptoms manifest in many ways consistent with Asperger's syndrome. So again, another distinction. I personally view that not as a neurological thing as much as, nature produces a wide range of dispositions that are conducive to species survival. But the culture, being relatively simplistic, is geared to the 80% of primarily extroverted, less sensitive people. But this, even so, all of that happening by age 10 has already put me in a less than 5%, meaning less than 5% of the population has complex PTSD, is isolated from media, going to a Waldorf school in an alternative vegetarian paradigm. So then we have vegetarian, overlaid that. We may now be down to 1% or less than 1% of the population being neurologically sensitive, having complex PTSD, going to Waldorf school, being isolated from media, being isolated from dense populations. I grew up in upstate New York, and it was a mile or so from the nearest house. So all of this occurring by the age of 10, then starting to move around. So living in upstate New York, born in Louisiana, living in New York, in upstate New York, which many people confuse with the city. It's actually far more rural than any place I've lived subsequently. Then moving to England, and then Cyprus, and then Scotland, and then Vancouver, Canada, and then Washington State, and then down to the San Francisco Bay Area, and then traveling and spending an extensive amount of time in Thailand. Again, in a travel pattern, one of the implications or influences, going from being an American child and then going to England, there was an immediate ostracization around accent, and with that ostracization, a sense of being different and referred to as an American. Now, getting to know the media in the BBC and then going to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, while still connecting with the BBC via shortwave in the BBC World Service. I got interested in the BBC. I also learned to read when I was around 10, which is later than most people, and then got into voracious reading. Being somewhat isolated and awkward in romance, not having a girlfriend until the age of 22, and then very briefly, and then not really a girlfriend until the age of 26. Again, an isolating, in terms of statistical data, experience, and not being particularly driven by sex in a culture that talks about men as if they are constantly driven by sex. I abstained from masturbation for a good year because I thought it would save time for meditation and other things. Being highly, going to the Findhorn community at the age of 12 and spending 6 months of my adolescent attending conferences and hanging out at the Findhorn community. Dropping in and out of school, first when my third grade teacher died, then when a replacement came who didn't know how to deal with trauma. The traumatic symptoms demonstrated, through hyperactivity, which the substitute teacher couldn't deal with. And so I was kicked out of school, out of Waldorf school, because the teacher threatened to resign unless I was kicked out of school. And so here again, a teaching disability being transferred to the student as a learning disability. In fact, my third grade teacher was the closest thing to a parental figure in the sense that I was able to connect emotionally with her in a more secure way than I could with either of my parents. There being a taboo at a deep level in the family system to avoid all intense feelings by both parents. So both parents having traumatic history instinctually avoided all intense emotions, perhaps for fear of re-triggering trauma. But that pressure on the children to have a relationship with parents without attuned, regulated, meaningful feelings creates profound isolation, which was compensated for in the relationship with my father with extreme mental extraction or abstraction. And, I can remember, wanting some kind of a secure relationship with at least one parent, finding that the only way to connect with my father was to have rather nuanced, long, very cerebral conversations. He didn't really know how to connect with a child, and so the only way to really enter his world was through, I guess, entertaining him mentally. And so my father being relatively articulate and, having a sadistic streak where he took pleasure in the helplessness of those around him, and having, an articulating talent, meant that in order to escape the many pitfalls that he created for his children and those around him, to look like idiots, because, as I say, that amused him. I had to, it feels miserable when you cannot have a secure relationship with either parent. And the only avenue is mental, and the mental avenue consists of humiliating your children. Then it became important to kind of elevate out of the helplessness and humiliation of those engagements, which led me to develop an awareness of my parents' patterns. In other words, to develop a pattern analyzing ability, to anticipate the various abuses that would be coming and avoid them, shunting some of them to my younger siblings. I'm the oldest of 5. But also, particularly with my father, I remember, at the age of 11, 12, starting to understand the way that my father set people up to be humiliated and look dumb, and to understand the pitfall that he was creating for people to fall into so that he could humiliate them. And understanding and anticipating where the pit lay. The way to frustrate my father, which was, I guess, the counter move to being in those humiliating situations, was to perceive the pit that he was creating for me to fall into, and then to kind of dance around the edge of the pit and anticipate in a way that the joke was on him, meaning that I didn't answer the questions in the way that would drop me in the pit, but would rather frustrate his efforts. Because these things, these passive-aggressive energies with an abusive parent can't be acknowledged directly, particularly with a sociopath who will deny them at all costs. You can't say, Dad, stop being a fucking asshole and, setting everyone up to fail. Because that is one of the pits. It's like, what do you mean? Well, this and this. I'm not doing that at all. It's not me at all. I have nothing to do with that. And so that's another exercise in frustration, because he can cuff you over the head or pull your ear or send you to your room if if he doesn't like that head-on attack. So the answer was not to fall in the pit and watch him frustratingly try to, throw me down in the pit and humiliate me. And so that was a way of transferring the helplessness that he would instill on those around him back to him without acknowledging the game. Because as a do-gooder, liberal idealist, he was well above, in denial of his cruelty. And so this, and so, of course, it couldn't be said that I was being cruel either. But really, it's a game in this case to see how viciously you can throw your children down into the mental pit of helpless humiliation versus how much you can adroitly go around it and not give him the pleasure of doing so. This very much cut into trust and spontaneity because, and this also was part of the underlying program, because if you can humiliate your children every time they go into an intense feeling, and then humiliate them for having an intense feeling, you're, in a sense, communicating the family law, thou shalt not have intense feelings. But as a child who's naturally spontaneous and trusting, etc., and wanting to bond, one has to learn to fight one's own healthy impulses to attune. Because with a healthy grown-up, a child tries to attune to their parent, And with a loving parent, the attunement results in connection, in love, in deeper trust and intimacy. But with a sociopathic parent, as you attune, what you're attuning to is their desire to inflict harm, physically, emotionally, psychologically. And so you have to learn to interrupt the natural bonding instinct within the child, to strategize in one's interaction, which transfers the disease of dissociative headiness from the parent to the child. So now there's a shared infection. And this is the only kind of maneuver to gain significance and respect in such a family dynamic. So my father gave up on me and transferred these attentions to my younger siblings once he couldn't flip me into the pit in a way that he found amusing. But by that point, I had already dissociated from emotions which would get me into the pit just about every time, because that's what was set up. And so this is one of the reasons why I don't consider the Asperger's type tendencies to be innate, but rather a learned behavior to mimic the learned behavior of my father, who was induced into terror by an alcoholic mother, and a father with PTSD from World War II, which both led him to, with the violence, to be terrified and alone, and not knowing how to deal with his own little boy inside, I would say a scared, terrified 6-year-old and a vindictive teenager, determined to get revenge on the world, all the while burying all of that under all kinds of idealism. He ran a nonprofit. He was a director of a currency hedge fund called Gaia Corp, with a focus on planetary well-being. And so this schizophrenia is also something that could not be acknowledged openly in the family system, but, had an embittering impact, the bitterness and the rage that not only was one continually subjected to cruelty, but that it all had a noble cause, led to, a tremendous amount of pent-up frustration and depression and despair and loneliness, because one could beat Dad with his own game, but one still didn't get any love. You could give some of the cruelty back, or you could accept all the cruelty. But either way, there was no deep emotional bond with either parent. Mom was in a fantasy world, which my father had contempt for. And some of that contempt traveled on, took on. So there was a certain allegiance, between the oldest son and the father, to have contempt for, the ditzy, kind of out of touch, klutzy feminine that my mother became to escape her own deep feelings, which again, determined to avoid. So moving from this, one of the things that this related to is, I would say that the more serious, thoughtful part of me that's always been present unnerved and angered some of my teachers. And I remember Peter Cook at Michael Hall, another Waldorf school, in one of my periods of being in school, because I was out of school in Cyprus. I was out of school for part of New York. I went to a public school in Sussex, England, where I was roundly humiliated for wearing used clothes. There's this charitable organization called Oxfam that sells used clothing that my father always liked to be thrifty. And, when someone asked where I was wearing some unusual outfit and I said it was from Oxfam, everyone was chanting, Oxfam rejects, Oxfam rejects. And I thought the whole thing was a joke. Just as without the media context, the way that children, chant these memes, I think Blackadder was popular in England at the time on TV, but of course we had no TV. And so, there would be these chants of memes that all the kids understood. And they of course made no sense. I remember one was throw a chicken in the air, put a dustbin up your nose. So this was a chant on one of these popular TV programs. And I thought they were all nuts. It's like, throw a chicken in the air? What, is this the best song you can be singing? So there was a little bit of I guess, mutual derision. I was the only one in the school that didn't know what was going on, why buying used clothes was apparently worth chanting about, and why people were, chanting these nonsensical tunes. And I thought they were complete morons for making such a fuss over nothing. And they thought I was a complete moron for not knowing what the hell they were talking about. And, so that bit wasn't particularly, damaging. It's just another, example of marginalization. Living at the Hoathly Hill community in West Hoathly, Sussex, England, a Waldorf-based community around common land, etc., similar to the passive solar home Waldorf community around Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School in upstate New York. There's a little bit of a theme of things being done a little bit differently, of a little bit more isolation, again, from the rest of the community. It's a divergent experience. And noticing some of the hypocrisy, and just the endless pontificating about Rudolf Steiner, while at the same time not being able to do your responsibilities, not being able to be honest, not being able to fess up to your own stupidity. So there's this constant underlying schizophrenia between the idealism and the daily life that, for me, led to a little bit of contempt, because that it was all reframed as being somehow this noble cause, and boarding school, I got very dissociative in Cyprus, without any structure and routine. I was the community leader at Hoathly Hill because I always had these unusual ideas. Secret forts was one of them. And, so I would be the only kid that would come up with the idea. There'd be a wood pile, for example, a pile of logs just thrown away. And so I'd say, here's what we need to do. We need to hollow out the wood pile in such a way that everyone else thinks it's a wood pile, but there's a tunnel into it. And you can see out and spy on other people. And there were these hedges in Sussex, England, 40-year-old beech hedges. It's a wonderful plant, the beech tree, but they made hedges out of them, and they were like 10 feet tall, which was over the heads of people walking through the corridors between the hedges. And so I was the one who came up with the idea that, all those little twigs on top of the hedge will break if you step on any one. But if you lay a piece of plywood on top of the hedge, then you can have a spying location on the plywood on top of the hedge. And, and from there, look at what's going on, observe conversations. And I was the one that hacked into the phone line going into the house and ran a wire up to my bedroom so I could have a phone, and then figured out how to attach a recorder such that the phone line would be recorded. And so there was this constant kind of spewing out of ideas that none of the other kids had. None of this occurred to them. The idea that there were new ideas, the idea of any of this, it was just not in their world, except when they were around me, which made me a fearful or a feared figure by all the other parents, because their children would behave predictably when they were behaving, and interacting with one another. But and of course, they were interested in novelty and creativity. So after school, they'd come round to find me to see what unusual thing that we could all get up to if I was the kind of kid leader. And so that was, felt like a little, I could tell that the parents were all looking at me as I would navigate around the community with skepticism, with suspicion, with veiled animosity, and a certain amount of fear. And I was very careful not to hurt anyone. But I did notice by, my mother, who, as I mentioned, very much in her own world a lot of the time, I had to find a way to exist for my mother. And so the way that I found to exist for her was to pretend to be naughty, which was not my disposition. But this fit her fantasy of what a boy should be like. And since she wouldn't see me as I was, I had to find a way to behave that kind of showed up in her paradigm. So here I was, completely ignored and invisible. And she was off in some fantasy world over here or over here or over here. And I wanted to exist, as every child does for their parent. And as I say, the way to exist with Michael, my father, was to show up in his mental world. Well, how do I show up in Sherilyn's world? And I found that if I would ignore who I was and move over in and be naughty, that somehow she would be able to relate to that, and it wouldn't make her uncomfortable, partly because it was inauthentic, and partly because it fit into her stereotype of her fantasy. So it made her feel comfortable. And so the trick was to pretend to be naughty without actually hurting anyone. So I spent a lot of effort putting on a costume of being devious and naughty, etc., because that got attention in a way that first caught attention and then brought a smile, as it was discovered it wasn't terribly harmful or anything, and made everyone comfortable because I was behaving the way boys were supposed to behave. And this was to be repeated later by all the women who would tell me that men were just interested in sex, and I wasn't. And so to exist, I remember actually starting to watch pornography as a discipline, to try and learn how to be the guy that all these women were talking about, which wasn't me. It was a projection, a stereotype. And so, escalating my sexuality to some extent was an effort to try and exist in a world where women defined men. I've had numerous conversations with women where I say, here I am, and they say, no, you're not. You're over here. This is how guys are. I say, here I am, and they say, no, you're not. You're over here. That's not how guys are. Guys are like this. I'm like, and I've even argued. I'm like, am I a guy? Will you look at me? No, that doesn't sound right. I haven't met someone like you. So, to exist, important in developing any regulating skills, which I've needed to catch up on, because you can't learn emotional regulation skills with parents that hit you or push you away when you get too close to their feelings, because they don't want to feel their feelings, because they're carrying, intergenerational trauma. Something, of course, I had no vocabulary to articulate at the time, but very much known and commented upon as an over-serious, much too mature for his age type of person, which was a mixed bag. I got to exist. I hung out with people 2 to 3 times my age, pretty much from the get-go. The seriousness of my interest that upset my teachers led me to play the fool. So if I was going to get yelled at or treated with some anger and fear as a sensitive child, not liking that, I found that my teachers were delighted if I wasted endless amounts of time being foolish. And again, to do it in a way that was not harmful, but diffused my apparent threat to the teacher. And so I would blurt out words in response to the, to various comments. And so I became a class clown, which never got a teacher angry. Being serious and putting the teacher on the spot made teachers scared, angry, uncomfortable, which made me uncomfortable as a sensitive person, because I wasn't trying to make people uncomfortable. I was trying to learn or explore topics. And so my kind of clowning was a little bit unusual. I think I learned it from Hans Schum, one of my woodworking tutors when I was out of school and after being kicked out of school in Hawthorne Valley. Because I was an incessant talker, bred that way by my father, and also to cover up the grief and loneliness and trauma of not having an emotional connection with anyone after my 3rd grade teacher died in a car accident, which in retrospect, I look back and I see that no one around me knew how to grieve. They didn't know how to weep. That would be an intense feeling. They didn't know how to empathize and connect. So there was nothing to honor this very significant loss. And I just went numb, and then began behaving more hyperactively to process the energy that couldn't be acknowledged emotionally in an emotionally illiterate family, in a relatively emotionally illiterate culture. In which grieving is not done the way it is done and has been done in thousands of cultures throughout history. So anyway, when I was endlessly talking in my woodworking tutoring, I would ask my Hans, questions, and he would say, "What fell down?" as a kind of way to wear me out. So no matter what I said, he would say, "What fell down?" And, I would just give up after a while, because you can't have a conversation when the other person responds, "What fell down?" as if this had it. So it was a complete non sequitur, and it kind of stalls conversation. He did it in a cheerful way and would go back to woodworking. And so I think I learned my style of kind of buffoonery in the school by saying things like that in the class. So the teacher would say, "Dane, what's the long-term vision of this and this?" And I would say, "Big Bill Ritchie," and which is, of course, a similar non sequitur. Everyone would laugh. So this was great. It wasn't making anyone upset. Of course, there wasn't any learning going on, but there wasn't any learning going on anyway. So so that again, an anomalous, type of class clown to cover a very serious part that was wounded by the hostility of the teachers around me. in and out of school, I left for Findhorn because I decided, at the age of 12 that the conferences, there was a guy named Sam Keene who did a presentation on Faces of the Enemy, one of his books, and he also wrote Fire in the Belly and stuff. And it was just so interesting watching him upset all these adults. I knew that whatever it was that was going on there was far more relevant and useful than anything I was learning in Waldorf, 6th grade. And so I left. And so there's a series of patterns around my kind of divergences that, like, I remember my 6th grade Michael Cook Waldorf teacher on the phone said, we can't let you back if you keep leaving school. And I said, well, okay, I'll take that risk. And then the people at Findhorn, primarily adult spiritual community, were also saying, hey, you're young, you should be in school. And I said, no, I'm going to do this. And I felt that I was making the right decisions at these points. And they were borne out, meaning I didn't regret them. And so another unusual thing is making major decisions from a young age that the adults around me protest, but that turn out to be good decisions that I like over time. I still like that decision. And this, in turn, leads to a growing sense of confidence from repeated past experience. And one of the reasons that I diverged, because this happened again in Vancouver, at the Vancouver Waldorf School when I left, everyone was against it. My mom was strongly against it. The teachers didn't like it. But I interviewed everyone. And I said, I'd like to understand your reason. And none of the grown-ups had competent analysis of why I should be in school. The best thing they would all agree on was that you're going to need a high school diploma so that you can go to college. And you're going to need a high school diploma and to go to college so that you can get a job. And I remember working that through. And I said, so you mean to say that you're acknowledging that this is a waste of time? Because my analysis said that I was spending 50% of, that 80% of the subjects that I was learning would not be useful to me in later life. And that the 20% that would be useful, I was learning at a 50% efficiency ratio, precisely because the teachers dreaded me raising my hands and getting into it one-on-one. So they didn't actually want the deep interaction that helped me learn and grasp the subject. Because I'm also an edge runner, having learned from my parents that I couldn't rely fully on their words or their integrity. So I had to watch the pattern. So it became very important for me to understand the limits of things on my own. And part of that was also an incredibly dysfunctional sense of order in the family. Both of my parents being children at heart, they didn't have discipline with one. I mean, my mother couldn't balance a checkbook. My mother couldn't do, what she said. She wouldn't keep her word. And my father would, had affairs. Went and did what he wanted to do and of course, wasn't there to hold a structure. So there wasn't a family routine. Which is very unsettling for a child, particularly when there's no secure emotional attachment. And so I had to edge run a lot and figure out what were the real boundaries. And the real boundaries were what matched up with action, not pontification and idealism and stuff, but this is what my parents will actually do. It's not what they say they'll do, it's what they'll actually do. And so I had to test out all these different gray areas, which have some pretty sophisticated programs in them. Because Dad will laugh at this if it's in public, but if it's in private, he'll be impatient with it. So you have to learn not only, these very complex set of behavior patterns that meet different agendas for my parents in different situations, and the same for the teachers and, the various grown-ups around. So there's very much, as a sensitive, not liking conflict, I had to do this kind of subtly to kind of feel out these patterns in the grown-ups around me and understand what really made them tick. Because as a sensitive, I didn't enjoy the explosive, unregulated energy of violence and other, outbursts that would affect me a lot, and which I couldn't predict from their words, mostly because a lot of these explosive energies were denied. They were in the shadow, denied, culturally tabooed. We couldn't talk about them, domain of the relationship. So how do you predict them better than your abuser? And so I got pretty good at that. How do you show up where they can see you even if it's not you? Where's the line where you get attention but don't get hit? That's a very delicate line because my parents didn't have very good regulation skills. So they would, like my mother, would ignore me a lot if she possibly could. So it was very hard to show up in a way that she'd actually see me. And usually it was upsetting her in some way. It had to happen to move from fantasy world to real world. But what's the point of upsetting her? That would upset her enough to get attention, but not enough to have the attention just be over in 3 seconds, where she just rages for 3 seconds and then goes back to ignoring me. And so how to play that edge when you've got a very volatile, it's all on or it's all off, and if it's all on, it's too violent, and if it's all off, I don't exist. And so, a tremendous amount of anxiety, and I would say this is where I developed my addiction to adrenaline in a certain extent, the constant fear and terror as a sensitive, trying to map these worlds out and exist but not be hated, in a violent way. Very, very difficult to do. And so the travel dimension, and the news dimension, listening to the BBC World Service in Canada and then listening to the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Network, the first thing I discovered was that news wasn't news. I'd be listening to the World Service, the BBC World Service, and I would learn that 3 Bangladeshis died in a landslide on a bus. And I'd say, oh, okay, that's news apparently for the BBC. Then I'd listen to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and that news wasn't news. And they'd have some other thing. And then when I came to the US and listened to the news there and the BBC, it's like, oh, everyone makes up their own news. And then you think about it, you realize, well, they've got 30 minutes to cover the world. They're obviously not covering the world. So what are they covering? And why does this country decide that this is relevant and this other country doesn't? It doesn't make any sense. And so this led to more of an analysis of different cultures, and in the back and forth of different living situations, also allowed me to understand how much of a culture was irrelevant to intelligence. One could say dogmatic. In England, for example, the locks on the doors that are still sold in many hardware stores are the same locks and giant keys of a 400-year-old Victorian house. My room, for example, in my bedroom, had this key that was this long, this big metal thing, this round shaft, and at the end, this thing that looked like a castle. You'd stick it in, and these locks were easy to pick. And they took a lot of metal. So you wonder, what are they doing? Putting these outrageously heavy, clunky, dysfunctional locks in, when in the United States, no one has a lock that's this absurd. And you realize, why are they doing it? Well, because they did it before. And because they did it before, because they did it before. They're not referencing best practices or technology. They're referencing the past in a way that is irrational for the stated objective. Now, this insight further leads to confidence. And because if you dig in, I talked with a lot of grown-ups, to try and find out how aware they were of these things. And for the most part, I discovered that I was thinking more thoroughly about all of this than any grown-up in my circle of awareness. And that's ultimately the point where I made a lot of my bets from. Because my bet was that, okay, so you're all against this, but none of you have any good ideas. And you're not thinking it through. You could be right. There could be a good reason to do what you're saying that you lack the intelligence to articulate. But if there is, you're certainly not articulating it, and I can't see it. So given the choice, I'm going to go with my well-thought-out reasons for doing it differently than all of you are suggesting. And every time I've done that, whether it was dating a 58-year-old woman for my first girlfriend, which everyone was against and thought was weird, well, I just looked at it. So why do men date women half their age and nobody thinks that's weird? That's just as weird. So it doesn't make any sense. And no, the most irritating thing, I would say, about the level of intelligence and thoughtfulness of the grown-ups that I've encountered is that they are content to maintain a dogma without substance, without substantive analysis, other than that it's not what's done, which is a tremendously weak argument. But they're also content to hold on to the idea that I'm wrong, even if I offer substantive, articulate arguments, which just means it's like you just want the world to be the way you imagine it for no particular reason, and you want to be right about it simply because you're doing it, simply because a majority of people here are doing it. That doesn't mean anything. In fact, I've come to understand that in the bell curve of adoption of any new technology, the majority is always wrong. So this built an unusual set of data. I mean, most kids don't leave school repeatedly and find it's to their benefit. But I also discovered something, when I first left school, I went into depression because there was no structure. So I understood that if I was going to leave school, I had to create a structure. So I created a very, very disciplined routine. So I went from no structure and kind of timeless, drifting, kind of, very vague states of consciousness to very precise, methodical states of consciousness, where every 20 minutes of every single day I was doing stuff on the dot. And some would be 40-minute blocks, and some would be 20-minute blocks, and some would be 30. But, to create a routine in a household of chaos, and to realize how fragile that routine was, but how valuable it was, how much it exploded my potential to get things done, to have a system, falling to sleep and having naps instantly. I got into channeled entities and discovered a whole new paradigm of looking at things, but also discovered that, a lot of it didn't make sense. Lazarus was my closest kind of ally or friend, starting at age 13, I would say. And I worked with the Lazarus material, the channeled entity, from 13 on till, early 20s. And in fact, until I was 28, 28, quite substantively. But also discovering that they didn't work, and so a divergent view of reality, nice insights, etc., but not leading to well-being in a lot of cases. So I've explored a lot of extremes, and in doing so, understood the relative benefits and problems. And I would say that I have a lot more confidence than most people to think things through, because confidence comes from experience, and I was getting these experiences from a very young age. You know, that I could predict my parents' behavior more accurately than they could. That I could predict what this person was feeling and doing more accurately than they could. And as I went into romantic relationships, the more in tune partners would tell me that I knew what they felt better than they did. And so a lot of anomalous experiences. So just about everything that I've done, whether it's, I've never worked for a person in my entire life. I started my landscape design and build company at age 17 after studying Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill and using a decision-making process that he outlined to decide between being a creative, spontaneous chef or a sustainable landscaper, and went through the pros and cons and 1 to 10 scales in each metric and picked landscaping, mostly because I didn't want to wait around for customers. I would find that incredibly irritating. And I didn't want to cook the same dishes twice, and I understood that the marketplace did not favor spontaneous inventions. I've invented more than 500 recipes starting at age 13 when I started cooking for myself, with a vegetarian backdrop. And I loved my recipes better than almost anything I can find out in restaurants most of the time. But I like inventing a new recipe. And how about this? And customers like to come and have the same thing they had before. And so for those reasons, it's better to do cooking for fun and, do gardening, becoming landscaping and landscape design, etc., for income. And so that's just, I would say, we're in the terrain of maybe covering 60% of the anomalous experiences of my life, which anomalous experiences lead to an anomalous mindset, which leads to an anomalous experience. Because it's not just that I've had very different experiences, but the different experiences have led to a different way of viewing things. And so the experiences that I have that are identical to what everyone else is having, I see them in a very different way. So I'm often the only person in a room who's looking at what everyone else is looking at from an angle that nobody else is voicing. And this is also somewhat polarizing. I find that groups split into thirds around me. A third that really like me or like some part of me. And that's another thing. I realized that, there's so many different parts that I can be this person in this situation and this person in this situation and this person in this situation. And no one person connects all the dots and sees all those parts. And I find it interesting to be aware that we live in a culture that is so fragmented that not a single human being that follows cultural protocol gets to see more than a third of me at most. So that's a culture of invisibility. If a third of the person is invisible, and the invisibility is mandated as invisible, meaning people are unaware that they're unaware about the majority of what's going on beneath the surface. And understanding that this isn't particularly personal. I understand we're dealing with an incredibly fragmented, isolated series of egoic realities that often have little or nothing to do with the other person, because it's even harder to connect the dots when I ask people questions. And question after question, they'll tell me no one has ever asked that question before. They've never asked the question before. And so they don't know the answer. And often the question is about them. I've asked dozens and dozens of people what makes them feel totally loved. No one has jumped right in with a clear answer. Now, this is one of the most important questions anyone could be asking anywhere, in any culture, at any time. And we live in a culture in which you can go cradle to grave without a single person asking that question and without it ever being answered, which bodes poorly for the prospect of a vast majority of people feeling completely and totally loved, something I certainly don't feel. And I don't presume other people are going to feel it if we just follow cult norms and protocols. So the bigger question comes, without pretending to have covered all of the anomalies. We're dealing with a statistic by this point that is, one in, we're dealing with somewhere between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in several hundred million people are in this particular statistic. And one of the most, and I would say broader divergences is that the vast majority of people around me are trying to fit in and be normal. But I like the parts of me that are divergent more than I like the parts of me that are normal. So I'm not trying to be normal. I'm trying to offer a menu because it's my belief that if more people had my experience, that they would be happier with my experience than they would with the norm. And that's been borne out the very rare times when people have said, let's do it your way. They tell me, I've never had such an alive experience. I've never done this before. This is so exciting. I've never felt so loved before in my life. I've never, and they are excited. In other words, there's a very tiny percentage of the population that says, let's give it a go. Let's do it your way. And 85% of those, just love it and have never done it before, which statistically suggests that if more people gave it a go, they would feel the same way, the way that I feel. But the vast majority of people block the experience on the grounds, not that it's clearly thought out, not that they've tried both. One of the most absurd jokes in this entire terrain is the people when I say, how about we do it this way for this reason, and this reason? And they say, but I've never done it that way. And this is their great argument why not to do it. And I say, you're exactly right. I say, and what's more, if you don't take the opportunity right here to do it this way that you've never done it before with me, statistically, you are never going to do it in your life. And why do I say that? Because I meet 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old people who tell me, having done it my way, that they have never done it in their entire life. So if nobody who does it tells me, oh, I've done that loads of times, and there's a better way of doing it, and 85% of the people that do it tell me this is great and I've never done this and I'll probably never do it with anyone else, well, the fact that you have an unusual opportunity to step into my world through my veil seems like a great invitation. And it seems like such a waste that we raise human beings, admittedly without any of this anomalous experience or very little of it, who protect the mediocrity of the status quo as if it's doing them a favor, when in fact it is the biggest prison preventing many of us from having extraordinary experiences. which paradoxically leads to one of my greatest frustrations, lonelinesses, and irritants, because the amount of people that reject being with me because it is an anomalous experience, not because they've tried it and don't like it, because it's an anomalous experience, leaves me incredibly isolated in a context in which I've already been isolated most of my life. And so I feel incredibly lonely a lot of the time, and have felt incredibly lonely starting in infancy by the isolation of parents, etc., while feeling like I'm sitting on a gold mine of possibilities that I don't get to share, that I don't get rewarded for, that I get punished every step of the way for, specifically for the most absurd of all reasons, that I've never done it before, so I'm not going to do it, which seems like a surefire way to never know anything. Because if we did that to every person and everything that's out there to be known, well, I've never gone skydiving before, so I'm not going to do it. I've never been to Cirque du Soleil before, so I'm not going to do that either. I've never been on a date before, so I'm just going to stay celibate for the rest of my life. No, it's not really that I've never done it before. That's true for a lot of people. But it's that there's no cultural context for a lot of these things that are more intelligent in objective metrics than what is commonly done. And, and this, of course, leads many people to view me as arrogant. And one of the things that's interesting to me is the blind spot of our culture. Because how arrogant do you have to be to dismiss an entirely different, well-thought-out way of doing things simply because you're not doing it? It's the kind of arrogance that America breeds. We're obviously the best country in the world, and so whatever it is that we're doing, however absurd, must be great, because we are great, because we said we're great, because we're great. And we don't bother to reference data. It's so fun, to find myself proved wrong, which I discovered when I went to Denmark and discovered that the Danish people have a 400% higher quality of life than the average American and pay an extra 20% in taxes to get it. That's an incredible return on investment, to pay 20% more for a stable 400% higher quality of life, in which your survival, your security, your love and belonging, and your self-esteem, as well as the development of talents and gifts and bringing those into the world, are institutionalized with free health care, being paid to go to college, being supported to find a great job, getting great unemployment, being trained to do your job really well, and having a rich social life based on a lack of fear. And they're much more trusting of other human beings, and they'll leave their babies out in the street and so. Just such a higher quality of life on so many levels, architecturally, environmentally, the art, the parks, the amount of spontaneous time to engage, the lower work week. It's just beautiful, absolutely beautiful. So I want to close with an extrapolation from all of this, which is one of the things that I'm frustrated by is that there is no structure and organization that has a place, a slot ready for me. And I'm on the outside. I wouldn't start a school or run a school like a Waldorf school, but I know all about its benefits and flaws because I've been in it and now I'm on the outside. I wouldn't do therapy the way traditional Western therapy is done. But I've done $140,000 of different types of modalities and healings, and I've compared one healer to another healer working with 40 different practitioners, and I understand that they don't understand what I see about their strengths and weaknesses because they haven't worked with 40 people. But there's no therapist who says, hey, Dane, tell me what I'm good at and tell me what I'm bad at based on all the analysis that you've done of all your different practitioners. There's no slot for this tremendous synthesizing, pattern recognizing talent that is not loyal to the organization, to the power structure, to the dogma, to the norm. It's loyal to human well-being. It's loyal to intelligence, the efficiency with which energy is transformed into human well-being. And that's it. It's loyal to you and your well-being. And that's it. There's no power, there's no organization that I care about more than I care about your personal well-being. And one of the hardest things to encounter in this world are people who are more loyal to their own well-being than they are to any power structure that they've been institutionalized and brainwashed into. And it's the saddest thing around to be advocating for another person's well-being and have that rebuffed so that they can advocate for a structure, for a dogma, for an institution that doesn't care about them as much as I do. It's a tremendous rejection of a very healthy, nourishing intention and science, because I believe in the science of feedback, the science of measuring. If I'm going to give a gift to someone, I usually float it. I'm thinking of giving you this gift on a 1 to 10 scale. How much would you enjoy receiving it? I look at their body language and their number. If both are high, I give them the gift. If the results correlate with their language and their body language, meaning if they seemed really excited and said it was a 10, and then when I give them the gift they are really excited, I do more of that direction. I give more gifts along those lines. If they say it's a 10 and I give it to them and I don't see the slightest bit difference, I don't trust their 10. I emphasize their body language more. I find the pattern that works. And I would say that in my view, every structure, every dogma, every culture, every person would benefit from selectively leaving 15% of their life, of their mind, of their heart, of their schedule open to intelligently selected criticism, anomalies, divergencies, tests, and experiments. And I'll close with one of the more interesting test results that I did when I was trying to figure out what brought the highest return on investment, basically with money, because I was having a difficult time with people. It's very irritating to try and give a gift and have to be, stonewalled in all the various ways people do when they're scared and don't want to admit to being scared and just put up various roadblocks to discourage you and just say, go away, we don't want any new experiences around here. And so I took $30,000 and tried to analyze how much happiness I could create with $30,000. And so I made a list of all the things that I thought that if I spent $30,000 on would bring large amounts of personal well-being. And one of the things on my list was a Traxxas VXL Stampede waterproof four-wheel drive radio control pickup truck that could drive through the water and maintain power. It was $650, so a noticeable chunk of the $30,000, and I was really ambivalent about it, and I didn't anticipate that it would justify the chunk of money in happiness, but it seemed like it might be because it was my own stretch into anomalous terrain of more playful consumerism, something I hadn't done much until that point. I'd been serious around money, not playful, and this was a deviation from my dogma of investing money wisely. This was not wise by any metric that I could see. It was playful. Now, this truck led to a $5,000 hobby in various radio control vehicles, but this truck single-handedly brought more joy to myself and others than any other $650 of the entire $30,000 chunk. The only thing that won higher was a trip to Asia, which cost around $10,000. My first trip to Asia, I went to the Philippines for a couple of weeks, stayed in 5-star resorts, and did a number of things on my bucket list. And that was the winner because it led to spending more and more time in Asia, which is one of the biggest increases in well-being. But this truck came second. A toy, a $600 toy. And it's stunning, the ripple effects that had. And it's another invitation to the power of anomalies. So I'll leave you with the idea that if you will create 15% of your routine over the course of a month to do things that might have a high yield in novelty and well-being, that don't actively hurt anyone, there will be places in your life for people like myself who have experiences and gifts to share that you don't know exist. And 99.9% of the multiverse is not only unknown, it is unknown. And all of the future that stretches ahead of our species is in that domain. The really meaningful gifts and nuggets and gems are in that unknown and in the unknown that we fear as a traumatized culture, but will ultimately come to embrace and value more than any single thing in our lives today.